Hi guys, welcome back to another video, or your first video here, I don't know. Welcome if you're new here, welcome either way. Today I'm going to go through my October wrap-up. Part 2. So next we have The Perfect Crimes of Marion Hayes, and I might actually talk about that in tandem with another book because that's the second in a series and I read both of those in the same month. So the first book in the series is The Queer Principles of Kit Webb. That one I gave 4 stars and I thought this was a really enjoyable read. So something of a subgenre that I've found is gaining more popularity at the moment is queer historical fiction, sometimes with a slight subplot of fantasy. This one didn't have that, it was just queer historical fiction, but that's more centered around hijinks and fast-paced plot and fun than it is about, say, being a smutty book. So, like, for example, I find a lot of the queer historical romances that I see are weird photoshopped couples with huge muscles in like a historical background setting, and it's very much a case of plot takes a back seat and is often incredibly erotica heavy. Not that I don't enjoy that every now and again, but it's just not my thing. But something I found coming out more has been this more fun plot driven narrative. And there are a couple of tropes in these stories that I feel like in any other context I think I really would be annoyed by them, but in this context I really enjoy. So a lot of them tend to have an incredibly arsehole-ish character who is really full of themselves, really arrogant, but underneath is incredibly caring. You also often have a very stoic character who it takes a while for them to trust people. It takes a while for them to really show their soft side, and it's often the pairing between those two characters where they learn to be soft and gentle with each other over time, even if there's a lot of distrust at the beginning and a lot of misconceptions about each other. And I love that dynamic. So The Queer Principles of Kit Webb had that. It follows a young aristocrat who is aware that he is on the verge of losing it all and essentially hires a highwayman in order to rob his own father. And it follows the highwayman that he asks, who has recently been incredibly severely injured in a previous job, and he has sort of tried to hang up the gauntlet, as it were, and gets embroiled into this situation. So I just thought this was an incredibly fun read. It had a lot of darker topics. It really explored homophobia at the time, how in certain instances having wealth and power and reputation can protect you from laws around homophobia. I thought that was really interesting. And like the cost of wealth, like the lives cost and the lives ruined to keep a very small percentage of people incredibly wealthy, and all of that discussion was incredibly good. There were also several occasions where I thought it was going to drop into some stereotypes that I find really annoying, like, oh, there needs to be conflict now. I'm going to have the characters argue about an insignificant thing and then they won't talk to each other for 3 chapters so that I can draw out the page count. So I hate that. I hate miscommunication being used to lengthen stories, where I'm like, this book wouldn't have a plot if the characters had one conversation. And I thought that was going to happen. About halfway through, there was a point where the characters have a bit of an argument, although with this, I could see both sides of the argument. I could tell why they were having the argument, and it felt right for the characters. And the fact that as soon as possible, they met up again and they talked it out, and then boom, end of argument. And I thought that was so good. I thought that it was a really good moment and it didn't slow down the pace of the story. So I really enjoyed that. Very quickly afterwards, I read the one that I gave 3 stars, which is The Perfect Crimes of Marion Hayes. So this follows side characters that we met in the first book, and it is really interesting in terms of timeline because it's not a direct, so this is what happened afterwards. A lot of it overlaps with the events of the first book and answers quite a lot of the questions that had arisen, but not in a way that the first book felt unsatisfying. So with this book, because of the fact that both of these are heavily involved with a relationship, just because I didn't find this couple as interesting as the ones in the first book, this one got a 3.5 instead of a 4. But something I found incredibly interesting was the power dynamic between these two characters. I thought that, I'm not going to say what happens in this book because that would, I think, spoil certain things about the first one, but Marion has had to deal with a lot of trauma in her life, especially sexual assault and birth-related trauma. Also, both of these characters are bisexual, so I didn't mention that. Both of the characters in the previous book were, one of them is gay and one of them is bisexual. Both of them are bisexual in this book. Or at least they don't use those labels exactly, but they talk about having had past relationships with both men and women. So because of this sexual trauma, she is incredibly reluctant to act on any impulses about having relationships with anyone really, especially in the cases where there is a possibility of pregnancy, because of the fact that a lot of her trauma is to do with childbearing and pregnancy. So it was really interesting how she was kind of paired with this guy who, like, he's very kind of rough around the edges, but is just such a cinnamon bun of a person. And he's like, it doesn't matter to me if we never have penetrative sex. I want you to be happy. And it was very much that she had control in the bedroom. And I don't think I've read that in this sort of context, like a historical context. And I thought that their dynamic was really, really sweet. And I feel like it felt more like a novel that fleshed out the first novel than something I loved on its own legs. But I did really enjoy it, so there's that. This is going to take ages. Anyway, so now on to my 4 stars, first of which is Me by Elton John. I know this has received a lot of press over the past couple of years, and I'm sure doesn't need another vote of approval, but this is really, really good. Something I often don't like about celebrity memoirs is the fact that, well, often they're put on my reading list because of book club, and they're often for people that I honestly have never heard of. So there's that kind of removal. It's not like I'm reading the memoir of someone who I personally like, whereas in this case, I really enjoy a lot of Elton John's music. And also the fact that, and this is totally their prerogative, if someone wants to write a memoir and wants to keep a lot to themselves, absolutely their right to do so. But I do feel like a lot of the time the writing can then feel very distant. Also, if it's someone writing about someone else's life, I find that it tends to be a case of words are being put in their mouths. I'm like, how could you have known that? You weren't there, or you were there, but you weren't in their head. So often celebrity memoirs do not work for me. This one really did. I really enjoyed learning more about, say, the inspiration for the songs and his creative process. And also I feel like he was just being incredibly honest. A lot of the things in his life have been incredibly public, being such a public figure. So I feel like, obviously, I don't know, but in terms of just the way it was written, it felt like, here's how these things went down. Here was my behaviour in this situation. I behaved like a shithead, and like these were the things I was doing. Like, I feel like a lot of it was incredibly reflective, but also it didn't shy away from the more negative aspects of his life and the drug taking and using sex as a coping mechanism and just situations that he was put in. And yeah, I just really, really enjoyed this. And anyone who's a fan of his music, I feel like you could get a lot out of this as well. So I highly recommend. I might have to split this video in 2. I've been filming for nearly an hour. Good lord. Okay. So the next 4-star I have is The Scarlet Pimpernel by Baroness Orczy, not Orczy. So this is not the most well-known classic, but this is a classic book about one of the French revolutions, the one with the guillotine, so the one that Hamilton is based on, not the one that Les Mis is based on. France have had a number of revolutions in their history, and in this time the French noble classes are being whittled down very fast thanks to Madame Guillotine. And this book follows a man who, through disguising himself in a number of odd disguises and through schemes with him and his very trusted friends, goes and rescues people from France and brings them over to England so they can be safe. This was an incredibly enjoyable read. In terms of the writing and being a classic, it was quite flowery, but not to the point where I didn't understand what was going on. It was more flowery in a way that even mundane sentences, I felt as I was reading like, oh, that was a really beautiful turn of phrase. That was a really wonderful way of saying that. And so I do feel like if it was written modern day, the content of this could make a very, very short book, but I did really enjoy the writing. Most of the book follows the main character's wife, Marguerite, and I really loved the way that this story was framed around her. It was very odd that the Scarlet Pimpernel, who is the name of the person going undercover, it was very odd how little he seemed to be in the book, especially given how much Marguerite is. And essentially, it's a story of the two of them overcoming their vices of pride and learning to trust in one another, again, after essentially rumours have split them apart. I also thought the commentary on extremism was a really interesting subtext in here. So Marguerite is quite a wealthy French woman, not high up enough in the noble classes to risk being, having her head chopped off, but she does have friends who are high up in the noble classes and in danger. But she's in this position where she's like, I disagree with the noble classes holding all the power, and I don't think we should have this system. But because of the fact that she's not on the side of therefore they all must die, the way that people perceive her opinions on the subject, because she's very much like, I can see both sides, but I don't think anyone should die, very much people on one side think she's on the other, and people on the other side think she's on this side. So I think the perception of people when they don't have an extreme opinion, I thought was a very interesting subplot in here. And I did feel this was a very enjoyable read up until the last couple of chapters. And I can see why when this had it, I think its most famous adaptation with, was it Ian McKellen? Anyway, when it had its most famous adaptation, they essentially cut it off at that point and then used the ending of a separate book in this series. Basically, near the end of this book, the characters start, there's a Jewish character introduced and there's a lot of stereotyping and really nasty talk about him, and that was just very uncomfortable to read. There was some effort to say, oh, it's the nasty French who feel that way, not us British people, which if you're not from Britain or France, you may not know the friendly rivalry that Britain and France have given our history. So I absolutely don't say that in a hateful way, but I do feel like not enough was done to expressly villainize those opinions, even though a lot of the opinions were coming from villainous characters, if that makes sense. That was just a bit of an uncomfortable reading experience, and I didn't like that. But it was a really enjoyable read, and I feel like as a classic in terms of how it's written, really stands up. So I do recommend. So next I have a short story that I read over Halloween, and that is A Tale for Halloween, which is a fairy tale following two children as two incredibly poor children, and it's a lot of fun. It essentially follows them and how they really want to have fun for Halloween, but they can't afford costumes, they can't afford to go out and play with the other schoolmates. The boy can't afford to go to school, and they essentially are in the garden and all of the vegetables start coming to life and they start following the vegetables, and then they have sort of a little adventure over Halloween night. And I just thought this was very, very fun and very sweet. I feel weird kind of rating it because it was so short, but it was a very enjoyable time. And lastly, for 4 star, God, I really have been filming for an hour now, good lord. Anyway, I read the first 2 novels in the Heartstopper graphic novel series. So I read the first novel of this a while ago, probably when I first bought it, and I thought that it was really sweet and really nice, and I was interested to see where it went. But the issue I had was because of the fact that, here, I'll show you. So in terms of the art style, it's quite a large sort of comic style, and because of that, not a lot of plot occurs per volume. And I know I could have just looked it up online, but I wanted to support the author and buy the physical copies. This started off as a web series that was released free online and then got picked up by a publisher and released in physical format. So I decided to wait to continue the series until I had a couple of volumes so I could just go through. This follows these 2 characters, Nick and Charlie, who are characters who are side characters in another of Alice Oseman's novels. A lot of her novels sort of exist in the same universe. There's also a character from Radio Silence, a book I really enjoyed by her, in this series. So essentially, this one follows the 2 of them as they slowly start to, well, Charlie very quickly develops feelings for Nick, but feels like he's very unattainable. Nick is this very popular rugby kid who we know has had relationships with women. He's like, well, Nick can't be gay. There's all these stereotypes and it's just going to be a one-sided crush. And Charlie's a very quiet person, but this friendship develops between the 2 of them and they sort of skirt around each other until they kind of realise that yes, they do indeed have feelings for each other, maybe, and it ends on this cliffhanger, which I was very annoyed that I didn't have the next book in the series when I first read it, but because I could just carry on, I did then read this volume. This one is very much about the start of their relationship, the start of the realising of feelings for each other. This one is more about them and their very, very new relationship. Am I gonna be spoiling things? While this book is up, if you don't want spoilers for the series, then skip ahead to the next book I'm going to talk about. But essentially, this one very much follows more Nick's struggles with coming out to himself. I found it a really interesting exploration of 2 people who are in a relationship where one person is not out to other people and doesn't want to be outed, especially since Charlie in the first novel, before the events of the novel start, was outed in, against his will in a very horrible way, and a lot of people were very negative towards him. So this was very much, so the first one was them acknowledging that they have feelings for each other. This one was very much self-examination and really discovering himself, especially Nick, and I thought this was really lovely as well. So I'm really excited to see where the series continues to go. So now on to my 5 stars. Good lord, I've been filming for ages, my throat is dry. I do have quite a number of 5 stars this month, which I'm very happy with, and I will start with I Hate Fairyland Volume 1. Thinking about it, I think this was more of a 4.5 than a full 5 star, and I will get into why. So I loved this. So in this world, young children can sort of fall into Fairyland from our world, and they get given a quest to find the key to the door to get out of Fairyland, and they get given a sort of protector, like a conscience, and they are let out into fairy world and they complete this quest. And Normally the child completes it within, say, 24 hours, at most a couple of days, and then once they complete their quest and find the door to get out, they can get out of Fairyland, and they are just returned at the same time to their family, and they've had a lovely adventure for a couple of days. The main character has ended up getting trapped for almost 30 years in Fairyland, has never found her door, and is essentially a full-grown woman in the body of an 8-ish-year-old, and is incredibly jaded and incredibly murderous because of the fact that she's been trapped here against her will and still can't find her door. And so this comic series is incredibly violent, incredibly bloody, but it has that juxtaposition of all that violence, but also very, very cutesy art style, very cutesy character design. And it was just such an interesting blend. I thought the design of the characters was so excellent. I thought that the banter between her and her sort of little guide was hilarious. You could really tell how he's become very jaded with the world as well after having had to take care of her all this time. And yeah, this was an incredibly enjoyable read. The only issue I had with it was the fact that there were certain parts of the lore that were incredibly fleshed out. A lot of the characters in Fairy World have to abide by incredibly strict rules, especially with their interactions between themselves and the guests from the human world. However, there were other parts of it where I was like, but how does this work exactly? Like, especially with whether or not the main character could get hurt or die in that world, or how quickly she could be like regenerated, or whether or like there was just quite a lot of instances where the character experienced incredibly debilitating things. In some instances were like blown up into little pieces, and it was a case of sometimes I don't know if there was a time jump and she was just fine the next second, or whether or not there was a long healing process, and just all of these different things. I think it was a bit inconsistent, and I would have liked a bit more explanation as to how that worked, but it was still an incredibly enjoyable read. Next we have some rereads. So I reread an old favourite series of mine. Let me see if it's easy enough to reach. Yeah, never mind, it'll be up on the top shelf and I can't bother to get my ladder. So I reread the fantasy series, I can't remember the name of the series overall, but the first book is Red Air, then you have Elf Defense, and then you have Socially Awkward. So this is a series of companion fantasy novels which are incredibly parody based, like they're not serious fantasy, and it pokes fun at a lot of the tropes. So these are incredibly trope filled, but in a way that the author is making fun of a lot of the tropes of the genre and just having fun with the characters. It's just a lot of fun, and I think I needed a pick-me-up, so I just like blew through the entire series. Red Air is the first book in the series and follows two boys who are locked in the same prison cell and have a very similar appearance. They both have red hair, and a rescue mission comes to rescue the long lost prince, and the only description they've been given is that he will be in this jail cell and he will have red hair. So when they arrive and there's two people with red hair, they're like, what do we do? And so they just take both of them, and the quest continues from there. The second book follows two elves that we meet in the previous novel, and they are given a quest by the king to complete themselves, and it's about their relationship with someone they meet in the kingdom that they are sent to. And the third one follows Dave the Orc and his relationship with someone who shares a love of dragons with him. So all of these books are incredibly queer accepting and queer in general, and also very positive about sex and queerness and relationships that aren't the heteronormative norm. So you have a gay relationship being the forefront of the first novel. You have a polyamorous gay throuple in the second novel. That one is the most sex heavy, and in both those novels some of the characters are gay, some of them are lean more bi. And then in the third novel both of the main characters are ace, and that was a really lovely thing to see. Socially Awkward is still my favourite. I really love the precious relationship that developed over that, and I feel like the danger with a series like this can be that, especially with a quest type format that happened in the first novel, I was worried that subsequent novels would basically send the same characters out on a different quest and it would be very repetitive. But that's not what happened here. It had a very different structure each time, and you follow some of the characters that you met in the previous novel and you introduce more, and they have very much their own storyline. So I really enjoyed these. But don't read these if you're expecting serious high fantasy. This is not going to be the tone that you're going to get, but for fun, these are great. Then we have another reread, and that is Legends and Lattes. So this again is what I think was described on the front cover as high fantasy, low stakes. So you follow an orc who is called Viv, and she has lived a very violent life up until this point. She has lived by her sword, and she's decided that she's sick of the life she's currently living and wants to settle down and open a coffee shop. And it follows her in that venture, the people that she meets, and like, it's just a delightful story. I really love the exploration of character. I really love the family that she builds in this community. I really love the burgeoning of a gay relationship as well in this as well. Why did I just say as well twice? And also I really love the fact that Viv is describes herself as someone who is large and imposing and muscular, and you know, she is huge, she is very tall, she's very large, and at no point is there any body shame associated with that. And I just really love those descriptions and the way that she was so sure of herself. And this is just such a great book. I know it's getting a lot of praise at the moment. I know it's also been nominated in the Goodreads Choice Awards, so that's what I voted for. So I do recommend that you check this out. So next we have a couple of comics. So first of all is one that's not a storyline, it's a collection of someone's artwork that's like comic strips, and that is I Left the House Today. I thought this was great. Again, no through plot apart from all being centered around someone and, you know, their emotional state, but I really love the character design. I really love the messages that it sent around. So this is great. Next we have another reread, which is My Red Strings of Fate, volumes 1 to 3. This one is a webtoon or manta comics. I can't remember on what app I read this on, but I just really loved it. The art style is a little bit too cartoony for me in terms of my personal preference, but I loved the diverse nature of this. I loved the themes of building an image of someone and having to change your assumptions about someone. It follows a human who read this novel and really loved this novel and falls into this fantasy world and realizes that she's living in the world of the novel that she loves, and starts to notice when the plot starts happening and sort of gets embroiled with some of the characters and essentially tries to right the course of the plot because there are things being triggered out of order. So it's a really fun series. I decided to reread it because I felt like it, and yeah, I highly recommend this one. So next we have what might be a bit of a weird pick, but it's called Photo Pantanal. I can't remember who this is by, it'll be on the screen. But essentially, the Pantanal is an area of Brazil, this wetland area that is incredibly beautiful, has a lot of wildlife. And I, in October, visited Brazil with some family and some friends and to see wildlife. And we spent the majority of our time in the Pantanal area. And basically at one of the hotels that we were staying at, well, not hotels, like lodges, that we were staying at, there was this book available on the dresser. I think they were trying to get us to buy it, but it's essentially a book about the local area. It has a lot of beautiful photos taken from around the area and a lot about the conservation, etc. So while we had an afternoon in the hotel room, I read it, and this isn't so much getting a 5-star because of, oh my god, it's the most amazing thing ever, but it's technically perfect for what it is. It gave me a wonderful idea of the area and of the wildlife and the people. I feel it was very well-rounded. It was very personable and not just fact, 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 fact. So yeah, I think it was very good, but I don't know, I probably wouldn't recommend this technically to anyone unless you are planning to visit that area of Brazil. But I mean, if you are, it's a great book. Oh my god, nearly done. So the last two are two from the same series, and that is Scarlet and Cress. Both of these are from the Lunar Chronicles. And yes, I really wanted to continue the series before I forgot everything that happened in Cinder. And like Cinder, these were really, really great. I think this is a young adult series that definitely holds up. I can definitely see why it continues to sell. I was going to say that I really wish these had cover changes, but I have found out recently that they do in fact have a new cover for these series. I just think these are so 2000s. And yeah, I think that the series just deserves so much more than this. And I really loved all the new characters that were introduced. I thought that each of them added so much into the world. I thought that just the expansion of the politics of everything and the no-win situations that these characters were put through, I just thought worked really, really well. Each one of these is essentially a very loose retelling of a fairy tale, Cinder being Cinderella, Scarlet being Red Riding Hood, and Cress being Rapunzel. And just the way that those elements of those classic fairy tales were built into this futuristic sci-fi fantasy world, I just thought were really, really seamless. And just later on in the books, as sort of there was kind of less in common with the original fairy tale because the characters were being taken in different directions, I just loved the little nods back to the fairy tales they were based on. So these were both very enjoyable reads, and I just think this series absolutely holds up. I really enjoyed these. Good lord, so after all that, I am finally finished with this video. I've been filming for an hour and 20 minutes now, good lord. So please tell me about a book that you have read and enjoyed recently. I'd love to, or that you didn't enjoy, but I'd love to hear about it down in the comments below, and I will see you in my next video. Bye.